Alright everybody, welcome back to Japan to 1868. So in this video and the next one, we're going to be talking about the Kamakura Shogunate and then the transition from the Kamakura Shogunate into the Muromachi period, and then from there basically go into the Sengoku Jidai. So when we talk about the Kamakura Shogunate, there's two ways we can basically approach this. We can say, well, it's a military government run by the samurai, for samurai, and the samurai are warriors. So we can look at a military history and political side of things, or we can look at the Kamakura period and say, okay, so it lasts between 1184, 1185, one of those years, depends where you want to put the start. And it goes up until about 1333. So maybe, 150 years? Something like that. In those 150 years, the contacts that Japan has with the mainland, so predominantly China, although also, Korea as well, oversees a lot of cultural exchange between the Japanese islands and the mainland, and it also sees a lot of intellectual development. So that's the other way you can look at this, is that on the one hand we have war, military history, and politics. On the other hand, we have intellectual history, culture, religion, art, that stuff. So what I want to do here is, in this video, we're going to focus more on the intellectual side of the developments of the Kamakura Bakufu, and then in the next video, we're going to talk more about military history, wars, and then Go-Daigo's uprising, the Mongolian invasions, the war between the courts, so the Nambokuto Jidai, and then the rise of the Ashikaga. So before we get started with that, just as a bit of a refresher, the Gempei War, which sees the Kamakura Shogunate basically come into power, lasts between 1180 and 1185. So 5 years approximately, and it predominantly sees two cadet branches of the imperial family, who by the late 1100s have basically become warrior families who employ samurai and other soldiers, and these are the Taira and the Minamoto. So when we talk about the Gempei War as being a conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto, we should be careful to not look at this as something that is strictly Taira against strictly Minamoto. What I mean by that is that both of these cadet branches had their own cadet branches. They had their own divisions. So when we talk about the Minamoto fighting the Taira, well, it's also the Minamoto fighting the Minamoto. So, for example, when Minamoto no Yoritomo, the guy that founds the Kamakura Bakufu, or the Kamakura Shogunate, if you want to use that word, tries to go west to Heiankyo to fight the Taira, he has to go through Minamoto no Yoshinaka, his cousin, who is not necessarily trying to outright oppose him. He's trying to just stall him so he can go claim the glory for himself. So Yoritomo sends his brother Yoshitsune to defeat their cousin, and then from there push on to Heiankyo. So my point is that, yeah, on the one hand it's Taira versus Minamoto, but they also have other rivals. Sometimes those rivals are their own family. Sometimes those rivals are other imperial cadet branches or other branches of the Japanese nobility, like the northern branch of the Fujiwara clan, for example, who also came into conflict with the Minamoto roughly during this period. But it ends in 1185 at the Battle of Danaura. So the Taira, or most of the Taira leadership anyway, it's a naval battle, and they realize they're basically screwed, so they jump off the ships and they pretty much all drown. So the Minamoto come out on top. So in the process of fighting the Taira, in about 1183, 1184, so about halfway through the Gempei War, the imperial court bestows Minamoto no Yoritomo with the title of shogun. So after the war, he still retains the title of shogun. So basically what shogun is, or was rather, was an ancient court title that, when bestowed upon a warrior or a noble or something like that by the imperial court, basically what it does is it gives you the authority to raise an army, to command an army, and then go fight the enemy. So, long term, what it does is it legitimates the use of force in Japan. So unless you have some kind of an imperial title like that, granted to you by the emperor, or somebody else in a high position in the imperial court, basically any martial action you might possibly take could be looked at as a rebellion. So it's very, very important to Minamoto no Yoritomo that he is granted the title of shogun. Now, what happens after the war is that he doesn't give up the title of shogun. He works his way into the imperial court system to basically do the following. He says to the imperial court, okay, look, you guys are aristocrats, you are courtiers, you are nobles, you're not fighters. I'm a fighter, I'm a warrior, and my family, the Minamoto, employ tons of samurai, we employ tons of soldiers, so on the one hand, yeah, he could just rebel and, like, form his own government, but why would you want to do that? You have to make your own government along with all the problems that come along with it. It's easier to set up a working relationship with the imperial court whereby the warriors, so the samurai and their lords, so in this case the Minamoto family, obtain legitimacy and imperial favor for their own rule from the imperial family, give it to the Minamoto, and then the Minamoto use their force to basically protect and defend the imperial family. So this is the situation that Minamoto no Yoritomo gradually develops over about a 10-year period between about 1184 and 1194, 1195, roughly. So this is what gradually develops into the Kamakura Shogunate. The system of dual governance where you have the imperial family and the court on one hand, and the shogun and his family and his soldiers, his fellow lords, etc. on the other hand, both of whom basically back each other up. So to do this, or to do it right basically, and have it be long-lasting, Yoritomo leaves the Heian court structure intact, and he takes from the aristocrats most of their land. He gets court titles in exchange for providing the court with money. He gets court titles in exchange for placing his own stewards over aristocratic land, so basically having his own people act as governors, etc. So my point with this is not a, or should not be looked at as a parasitic or one-sided relationship. The situation develops in such a way that both sides basically need each other, at least in the initial period. Otherwise, this is not going to work. Because if there is no shogun, if there is no head of the samurai heading the samurai and trying to keep them in line, well, then you could potentially just have further disturbances and rebellions that had happened to the imperial court over the previous 100 years. And if they do not, by they I mean the Minamoto clan, if they do not attempt to seek imperial legitimacy and backing for what they're doing, then what they're doing has no, well, it has no political legitimacy. So there's every possibility the court could just raise the banners against them as well. So my point with this is that both of these structures need each other to survive. So in the middle of the Gempei War, like we just went over, Minamoto no Yoritomo is granted the title of shogun, as well as a couple other court titles, which basically give him the legitimacy to go raise an army and go fight the Taira. Well, after the war ends in 1185, he tries to keep some of the higher ranking titles, because in his mind it would give him more legitimacy to what he was trying to do. The court says, no, we're not doing this. And in 1192, they basically make it permanent that your title is going to be shogun, which is in terms of where all these different offices and court ranks and stuff like lay in the imperial prestige ranking, shogun was kind of a middle to lower prestige title. So the idea, at least we think the idea, rather, is that the court tried to give him permanently this lower ranking title because in theory it would maybe make him easier to control. But we have a problem here, and the problem is that Minamoto no Yoritomo dies in 1199, and yeah, I mean, technically he has a son who technically, like, inherits the title of shogun, but really Minamoto no Yoritomo's wife, a member of the Hojo family, begins to pull strings behind the scenes, and in 1203, so 4 years after Yoritomo died, so basically not that long. They don't have too much time to really work their way into things. This happens pretty quickly. The Hojo become the regents. So just as aristocratic clans, originally like the Soga and then like the Fujiwara, would try to pull the strings behind the scenes and really control the emperor, well, that's still going on. And now the Hojo are pulling the strings and controlling the Minamoto shogun from behind the scenes. So we have a dual power system, the imperial court and the shogunate, and then we have like two kind of shadow governments behind the scenes. So this is a very complex political situation, and it's through all of this shadow government, it's through this dual power structure, it's through trying to secure a greater hold on power than the Minamoto initially had, that by the late 1200s, the Hojo family has basically alienated a lot of their vassals, and they've alienated a lot of their allies, with the result being that by the late 1200s, so around the time of the Mongolian invasions, a lot of these local lords and local power blocks start seeing themselves as, if not autonomous units outright, definitely as something that would gradually develop into some kind of autonomous unit. So you're a local lord, you're a local power broker, and you nominally have ties to the Hojo, but or the Minamoto, but over time, that part of your identity begins to weaken. And it's in this context that in 1274 and 1281, we have the two Mongolian invasions, both of which are repulsed by a combination of a typhoon. So this is the famous, kamikaze, the divine winds, which smash up the Mongolian fleet. And they're also defeated both times on the shore by Japanese samurai. So for a very long time, it was believed by a lot of Japanese scholars, or scholars of Japan rather, that it was the divine wind. It was the typhoons that basically saved Japan. Well, this has begun to change recently, most notably with the scholarship of a guy named Thomas Conlon, who has looked at what documentary evidence exists for these conflicts, which isn't that much, actually, compared to what we have from, like, other periods. And he's come to the conclusion that the Japanese probably could have defeated the Mongolians on their own, even if the Mongolians attempted some kind of a full-scale landing. So what's the evidence he's drawing on for this? Well, the evidence he's drawing on for these conclusions are what are known in Japanese as something like battle reports or battlefield reports. So basically what these things are documents submitted to a lord or a general or some high up figure, and they basically say, I am, insert name here, so I am this samurai, I am this warrior, I did this on the field, so it's some feat of valor. I took this many heads. I killed this commander. I did something worthy of, like, renown or fame. And then they close by saying, This person, so insert other name here, is my witness. So when you would submit these battle reports, the idea basically was, I'm submitting this document, which tells about my exploit on the battlefield, and then you, as my lord or my commanding general or officer, something like that, you are going to reward me. So this might be in land, this might be in money, this might be with a new sword or a suit of armor. You're getting a reward in some way, shape, or form. The problem with this is that initially, like, okay, yeah, the shogunal government is able to reward a decent chunk of the samurai, but gradually, enough battlefield reports are coming in that they aren't able to really do this to the extent that they really should have. So they start cutting down on rewards, and sometimes they just don't reward in general. So the result of this is that these lords who employ these samurai start looking at the Minamoto government, so the Kamakura bakufu, at this point led by the Hojo, and they start looking at them less and less as their actual lords, because they're not able to, hold up their end of the bargain. They start looking at themselves as local power blocks, more autonomous now than they had been before, and they start looking around for maybe some other person to kind of throw their weight behind. And as it happens, in 1326, there is a new guy to kind of throw your weight behind. So for a couple decades now, by this point, the Hojo family have been playing emperors against each other. And they'd been playing emperors against the bakufu, they'd been playing emperors against other lords, against court nobles. Well, in 1326, this Emperor Go-Daigo names his own son his heir. So powerful court factions are not able to select the imperial heir at this point now, because Go-Daigo has named his own son as heir, and 5 years later, in 1331, Emperor Go-Daigo revolts. And by the way, we're going to talk about all this stuff in much more detail in the next couple of videos when we get into military history in more depth. But basically what happens is, when Go-Daigo revolts in 1331, his rebellion doesn't last that long. In 1333, the Kamakura Shogunate collapses. It collapses because of all of these factors we've basically gone over up until now. And now the problem is, well, there are other power blocks now that are competing with Go-Daigo. So on the one hand, we have Emperor Go-Daigo and his rebellion. We have the Hojo family, to the extent they still exist after 1333. And we have other power blocks, which basically results in this period, which goes up until about the 1380s, 1390s, which is called the Nanbokuto period, the war between the courts. So the Hojo family initially send this guy, Ashikagatakauji, to go deal with Emperor Go-Daigo and his rebellion, but Ashikaga changes sides. He supports Go-Daigo, he goes against the Hojo, and then he destroys the Hojo in Kyoto and in Kamakura. The end result is this period in Japanese history where the imperial family kind of splits in half. You have a group called the Northern Court, a group called the Southern Court, and they're basically now fighting with each other in order to determine, well, which branch of the imperial family is going to rule. Eventually, Ashikagatakauji takes over, and he establishes the Muromachi, otherwise known as the Ashikaga Bakufu. So that's like a brief political outline of kind of what happens. Now what I want to do is transition a bit more into the intellectual and religious history, and then talk a little bit about the samurai in this period. So the Kamakura Bakufu, or the Kamakura Shogunate, like we've talked about, partially takes power away from the imperial court and it sets up a dual political system. And it's under this dual political system that Japan starts having to deal more definitively with the implementation of Chinese culture, specifically with the whole idea that society should be structured along patriarchal lines. So, the Taika Reforms, as we've gone over in previous videos, in 645, declare that, well, most, if not all, the lands in Japan, technically speaking, are owned by the emperor, and then the emperor takes a population census, and then he divides up the land in Japan along what's called the equal land system, which is based upon the Tang Chinese model. So basically what happens is there's a census. Depending on how many people are in your family, you get a certain amount of land. It happens every 6 years, and if you are alone or your family is relatively small, the men will receive 2 units of land, and they also get labor and military service going along with the granting of that land, in addition to a tax. So you're given land by the imperial government, but you have to repay it through various means. And the thing with the tax system, and this is where we get into the whole idea of, well, how do we structure Japanese society if we're implementing Chinese ways of doing things, is that the tax system is twofold. We have a grain tax, so the actual rice and other crops produced, and then we have taxes in kind, which basically is taxes paid in the form of goods so that the government has a stockpile of stuff they need. Usually in this early period, it's heads or bolts of cloth woven by women, and it's in this period under the equal land system that women are also given land. It's a third less per head, but women also have a tax advantage. They pay less than men do, and they also have no military service. Now, by the time we get into the Kamakura bakufu, this really starts leaping forward, and it really starts making big strides in how Japanese society is structured. And women are basically barred from being in the military, at least officially. And the military becomes coded as a male-only occupation. So the governmental reforms divide Japan into provinces, and then we have governors collecting those taxes for the provinces and then other states. But in order to do this, and this really is something that continues up until the 1100s and a little bit into the 1200s with the foundation of the Kamakura Shogunate, is that, well, you have to pay all these taxes on your land, in addition to military service, which takes you away from your land. And then you have to provide your own equipment, you have to provide your own rations, etc. So, if you have to do all this, and you still have to farm your land to pay taxes, and you have to get all this other stuff, well, then if you don't have a big family to kind of work the farm when you're gone, in the 700s, 800s, 900s, 1000, so like that period, your land could potentially become worthless because you're away enough that you're not necessarily able to farm it and make it productive. So what do? Well, you try to avoid the taxes. So how do you try to avoid taxes? Well, the Lord could underrepresent or underreport the population in the census every 6 years. Or maybe, with all these pandemics and stuff going on in the 700s and 800s, into the 900s, you could maybe try to work out a system whereby you keep the land, but you don't pay taxes, you only pay in labor. And this basically is what starts to happen. So in 723, the court makes new land tax exempt for 3 generations in an attempt to kind of bring more stuff, more land under cultivation, so you can get more resources like rice and other stuff. And in 746, a new land tax law is passed, which makes new reclaimed land tax exempt perpetually. So gradually what happens is people start looking at this and like, okay, well, who controls this new land? Well, on the one hand, it's the nobility. On the other hand, it's temples. So you start bestowing or start granting the land you own to temples and to other lords who have tax-exempt land, with the understanding that you are giving them this land that's now tax-exempt, but you work it for the lords and for these temples. And this basically is what develops into Shogun. So by the 900s, there were too many of these Shogun that the court is not able to get enough tax revenue, so it tries to start reducing the number, but by the late 1100s, so into the development of the Kamakura Shogunate, and I'm mentioning this because this is all going to be important in a minute, this is the situation. The court still is not able to really get enough tax revenue through many of these gigantic estates. So we have these large untaxable estates called shogun. Well, if we're implementing a Chinese way of doing things, meaning structuring Japanese society along male-centered lines, well, what do we do with earlier laws where the women were granted land and allowed to, basically own it and farm it? Well, basically what happens is there starts to be a struggle for land rights. And this is something we talked about a little bit in the previous video, but basically, who controls what land? Some lords had a precedent to taking certain actions over certain kinds of things on their land in a certain area. Well, the Kamakura Shogunate is established, and you move one lord from one shogun to another. Well, are there things on those new lands that act as precedents for the new lords to basically keep doing what they were doing? It's not really clear. So to settle all these problems based around shogun and other land formations, the Kamakura Shogunate becomes one of the most litigious states, or most litigious governments, rather, to basically ever have existed. Every time period, for whatever reason, has one kind of a source which survives in greater numbers than other sources from that period. Well, in the Kamakura period, most of what we have surviving are like legal disputes and court documents. Most of it is over this stuff. This long-standing issue of land rights, which stem from about the 700s, going into the 1200s. Do women have access to it? Do they not? How do we work out tax rights? How do we work out any and everything basically involving land? So this is what a lot of these legal documents are for. And this is what most of the court cases in the Kamakura Shogunate basically were. But to really understand this and understand how women develop in this period, we have to talk about the Kamakura period samurai. So in the previous video, I talked about this great epic of samurai literature, a Gunki Monogatari, or war tale, the Tale of the Heike. So the Tale of the Heike, by the time it's written down, because there were a couple different oral versions of this before it was actually written down, it tells the tale of the Gempei War, a little more along the lines of the Taira side of things than the Minamoto, but what is important with the Tale of the Heike here is that it's one of the foundational stories or foundational tales for samurai power and samurai value. So it's during the Kamakura period that the Tale of the Heike sets the foundation for later developments in literature, drama, some samurai ethics, and basically, yeah, on the one hand, it's about samurai values, or what eventually develop in the samurai values, so things like violence, honor, glory, loyalty, and betrayal. You can see I have it on the screen here. But, on the other hand, the Tale of the Heike is also a story about Buddhism. It opens up with the lines that, the prosperous must decline, and everybody is as dust before the wind. So no matter how high and mighty you are, at some point you are going to die. So, you are mortal. And in Buddhist thought, when you die, you are reincarnated into the next life. Where you are or what you are reincarnated into is heavily dependent upon how you behave in this life. So a lot of what the Tale of the Heike is about looking at warfare and the whole idea of being a samurai as living a life of violence and inevitable destruction, which leads to fear, because you might be reincarnated in a less than nice situation. Well, how do you overcome fear? Well, you overcome fear through Buddhist practice. So it's also in this period that we see, or it's also in this tale rather, and then through the tale and into the period, that we see a great increase in Buddhist thinking, in Buddhist values, and it's through all of this stuff, through dealing with warrior values, with Buddhist values, that we see the samurai stand out from the imperial court culture. And it's through stuff like this that we really start to see how marriage patterns and gender roles are changed in the Kamakura period, which affects land tenure. And it also impacts how samurai start thinking of this whole idea of like redemption and Buddhist salvation, all of which is basically going to be the rest of the video. So the Gempei War and previous conflicts like the Joki War, which happened in 1221, as well as other conflicts like Godaigo's Rebellion, all of this contributes to Japanese instability. And that instability, going along with the implementation of Chinese culture, influences and changes marriage and inheritance practices, especially of elite families. So not necessarily like the poor people, but definitely the samurai, especially upper-level samurai. Definitely the warrior aristocracy, so the Bushi clans. And what basically happened as far as land tenure and marriage patterns and gender roles are concerned is that initially we have uksora local ways of doing things, whereby you're in a marriage, but you don't necessarily live with each other. The wife lives with the parents, lives with her parents, rather. And then we also have neo-local marriage. So we have a couple, a married couple, that is, kind of branch off and form an independent household. So we have these two ways of doing things. And these systems last until about 1300, so about the end of the Kamakura period. And then in the 1300s moving forward, we have vira local marriage. So the wife now comes into the husband's family and lives with them. So we have a drastic shift here where initially the women lived with their family, despite being married. Sometimes they'd go out and found their own family with their husband. But now 1300 moving forward, the wife goes to live with the husband's family. So this shifts gender roles, gender expectations, and it shifts how people inherit property, how people maintain property, etc. So wives in samurai families in this period start changing how they are understood by the rest of the family. So now, with the widespread influence of Confucian thought, so coming from China, being a widow and then remarrying is not acceptable. You can't do that anymore. You become central in the family as a mother, as a wife, as a home carer or a home taker. So what we may sometimes consider to be like traditional or stereotypically traditional gender roles for women, but what's important here for the samurai is that it's in the Kamakura period that despite these shifts starting, the elite women, so the Bushi families, so the aristocratic cadet branches that take on warrior characteristics, and upper-level samurai, so these kind of families, the women still continue to be managers of their husband's household. So the male might technically own land, but the female is the one who runs it. So without the female, you're basically screwed. So it's with this in mind that when we look at samurai households, what's called the IE, i.e., there are multiple power structures that develop among the average individual, among the common population. We don't really know. We have some archaeological evidence, but we don't really know how they live. At best, we can probably say that they live in nuclear families and they rely on shared labor. The samurai don't necessarily do that. So, it's during the early and mid Kamakura period that women, because they are able, or because they're supposed to, rather, maintain the property and maintain the household, women have inheritance rights in this period. And because they have inheritance rights, they have more political power and influence than they did during the Heian period, and they do in the period after. But in 1280, in response to the Mongolian invasion, or attempted invasions, rather, the shogunate makes a couple laws that limit female inheritance to maintain funds for defense. Now, here's where we start getting into what I think is really interesting, and my wife also thinks is hysterical as well. Yeah, after the Mongolian invasions and moving into the 13 and 1400s, there are many restrictions on women, what they can do, as far as property is concerned. So gradually they can no longer inherit. Not really. If they have some property, it's really limited to one generation. So some of it goes to your daughter, but then after that it goes to your husband's household. But coming out of the Kamakura period and going into the 1500s, a lot of primary sources still state, especially European sources who found this to be rather interesting, that husbands and wives have their own property, and that property is separate. So some of it's a dowry, but eventually it goes into the husband's name as far as land is concerned. Land. Let me reinforce that. 1300s and forward, women no longer really have right to land, but everything that's not nailed down on the property, they have a right to. So if they get a divorce or something, they leave. Everything that's not nailed down, technically speaking, they could take with them. So it's with developments like this that get worked into land tenure systems, how samurai households begin to identify themselves, how they begin to conceive of themselves as warrior houses and nothing but, that Japan begins to be restructured along Chinese societal lines. And it's also with these developments that we get a new intellectual and a new cultural development. And that's that in much of early Japanese history, women had a very high position. In many ways, this doesn't stop, and we'll talk more about this as we move forward. But going into what we typically would call like medieval Japan, 1300, 1400, etc., women begin to be viewed as creatures of jealousy. They are highly sexual, which a lot of people looked upon as immoral, despite the fact that some samurai would have drunken tea parties and then have orgies, which is... it's just a weird cultural phenomenon that you would do that and then look at women as immoral. But increasingly, they become linked to demons, they become linked to pollution, they become linked to sin, all of which is connected to Buddhism. And now, with this whole idea of, well, to be a samurai is to be a warrior, to be violent and to kill, and to be a woman in medieval Japan is to be, I guess, unclean or impure. Well, how do you then achieve salvation? How do you ensure that you don't go down a couple steps when you die and are reincarnated. This is where popular Buddhism comes into play. So, in China, under the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century, there was a persecution of Buddhists. Buddhist monasteries are burned, many Buddhist priests are killed, some are forced to leave the religion. And Buddhism does not really regain the same importance in China that it had previously. In Japan, the opposite is the case. So in the Kamakura and the Muromachi, otherwise known as the Ashikaga periods, so between about 1185 and 1460, roughly, because then we start getting into the Sengoku Jidai, Buddhism becomes significantly more important because it has to deal with a couple different things. Mainly, we have all these societal issues. Well, how do we ensure that these lowly people and these violent people, meaning women, lower ranking people in society, and samurai, how do we ensure that they obtain salvation? And the answer the Japanese come up with through some cultural exchanges with China, as well as some indigenous developments, is 3 schools of Buddhist thought. So this is Pure Land Buddhism, my personal favorite, Nichiren Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism. Of the 3 in the Western world, we are probably the most familiar with Zen. And by the end of the 12th century, all 3 of these different schools spread widely beyond the court, and they start making inroads among the ordinary, average, poor population. So this becomes something that works with upper levels of Japanese society, like the court and the samurai, and the peasants. So in 1175, this guy, Honen, reads a 7th century Chinese Buddhist commentary which advocates the chanting of what's called the Nembutsu. So, I take refuge in the Buddha. This is a chant that you can say during meditation. It is a chant you can say while studying other texts, etc. So, what Honen does with this is he gradually develops a form of popular Buddhism called the Pure Land, or Pure Land Buddhism. Basically, what it is according to Honen, the average person doesn't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the means to go stay in a monastery their whole life, ponder Buddhist texts, Buddhist sutras, and reflect, and gradually achieve enlightenment, and thus salvation. No. According to Honen, you have to say the Nembutsu, I take refuge in the Buddha. And it is the single and only practice to gain enlightenment. After death, you are reborn in paradise. So this is an example of Buddhism coming out of India, moving through East Asia and taking on more of a religious aspect. So you are reborn in a form of, I guess, what we in the West would maybe consider to be like heaven. And nothing else is necessary. You just have to say the Nembutsu. So this is a form of popular Buddhism because it's open to everybody. And going into the Sengoku Jidai, Pure Land Buddhism will transform into this thing called True Pure Land Buddhism, which argues that Pure Land is corrupted, it's not quite accurate, and it gets its own Buddha, Amitabha. And the Amitabha Buddha will you say the Nembutsu, and you are thus saved. So, you play video games like Shogun 2 Total War, you watch some anime, you read some manga based in the Sengoku Jidai, and you may encounter these guys called the Iko Iki. We'll talk about them more when we get to the Sengoku Jidai, but the Iko Iki are adherents of true Pure Land Buddhism. So it's a popular form of Buddhism. A lot of peasants, a lot of merchants, artisans, etc. like this. So this contrasts very strongly with Nichiren Buddhism. So who was Nichiren? Well, Nichiren was a samurai from a minor samurai family, and he is studying, or was studying when he was alive, a branch of Buddhism called Tendai, or the Tendai Doctrine. It is through studying Tendai and other Buddhist sutras and holy texts that he comes across the Lotus Sutra. And according to Nichiren, you achieve salvation by chanting I take refuge in the Lotus Sutra. So, Nichiren Buddhism is or has been described as a distinctly Japanese form of Buddhism. So, this is something we're going to talk more about in the companion series I have to this, so Japan from 1868 to present, because Nichiren is very nationalistic. He is very militaristic as well. He claims that he predicted the Mongolian invasions of 1274 and 1281. He claims that the reason the Mongolians invaded were due to false doctrines of other Buddhist sects. So Nichiren Buddhism is something that gets wrapped up very, very strongly with nationalism, with extreme sectarian forms of nationalism, by the way. And he attacks other forms of Buddhism. So it is during the 1900s that we have all these extremist militaristic Japanese thinkers like Ishiwari Kanji, who basically initiated the Manchurian incident, which led to the creation of Manchukuo in China, as well as others, that helps serve as a bridge for Pan-Asianism, which helps justify Japan's actions in the 20th century. And it is through Nichiren Buddhism that the Japanese attempt to develop their own brand of this thing that kind of looks like fascism, but isn't really fascism because it's Japanese, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that in the second series. But this is Nichiren Buddhism. It's very nationalistic. It's very, very tied up with Japanese extremism. And the last form of Buddhism that's developed in this period is Zen. So at the end of the Heian period, so the 1100s, some Buddhist priests go from Japan to China to study, and in China, they discover Chan meditation, which is related to Chan Buddhism, so they bring this back to Japan, and Chan Buddhism becomes Zen. Zen is important because this is all about self-realization, self-discipline. I've talked about it in previous videos, so I won't really go into too much detail here. But Zen Buddhism is all about being very uncomfortable, both physically, so you have this rough, very painful, cross-legged meditation where you're in a stance called full lotus. So this is where the ankles and feet are basically up on your knees. Having practiced Taekwondo, I've done this. It is extremely painful after a while. So you do stuff like that where it's uncomfortable. You focus on things that are maddening. So what is the sound of one hand clapping? I've mentioned this in other videos. You can do this. Two hands makes a noise. This does not. And yet, according to Zen Buddhism, doing this must make some kind of a sound. So it's through difficult, maddening stuff like this that, according to Zen Buddhism, you will eventually achieve enlightenment and thus salvation. You will move up to the next rung. So stuff like that was attractive to the samurai because these were military people. They were used to discipline. And Zen is a discipline of Buddhism that is extremely intellectually and physically rigorous. So the samurai were attracted to this particular branch of Buddhism. Now, going along with the whole situation of women and the implementation of Chinese culture and Chinese ways of doing things in Japan in this period, Zen actually is pretty favorable to women. So this is because in Zen there are things like communal meditations, communal debates, communal lectures, detailed regulations of behavior, and communal, well, I guess basically communal study groups. So these are systems where equality is basically the norm because everybody's working together to achieve enlightenment. So in Japan, In 1185, we have no Zen monasteries in Japan. By 1333, we have a couple hundred of them. So this very quickly takes off, and by 1600, we have thousands. So just as a couple examples of how Zen is favorable to women here, we have a quote by Dogen, who's a Japanese Zen priest, who founds a branch of Zen called Soto Zen. And I'm not going to read it. You can read it. But my point is that he's arguing that it doesn't matter who you are. Learning the law of the Buddha and achieving release from illusion has nothing to do with what sex you are. Has nothing to do with whether or not you're a man or a woman. And it's through this manner of thinking that we get the first Zen priestess, Mugai Nyodai, in about the 1250s. So she's the first Zen priestess and the first Zen abbess in the world, which is, as far as religious matters like this are concerned, absolutely huge. So going along with these three branches of Buddhism in this period, Buddhism impacts Japanese culture in many different ways. So, we think of this thing in Japanese culture, the tea ceremony. Well, tea is introduced through Buddhism as a way to keep people awake while you are meditating because it's caffeinated. And it's through a combination of Buddhism and Confucianism that we get more things like calligraphy, painting, philosophy, Zen garden design, ceramics, etc. And Zen Buddhism, because it's attractive to the samurai, becomes very attractive to the Hojo family, the people basically in charge of the shogunate in this period. And we get this guy in this period who is associated with the samurai to a degree. His name is Kamon no Tromme, and he's an author and an essayist, lives between 1153 and 1216. He writes this not really a story, it's not really a diary. It's called An Account of My Hut. Basically, what he does is he kind of does like a medieval Japanese version of like Thoreau, where he retreats into nature to live and to meditate. And the Account of My Hut really speaks to the whole idea in Zen that you must be disciplined and you must be rigorous, because he's in this tiny little space. He doesn't really leave it. He has supposedly one book, and all he does is study that text and meditate all day. So after Tromme dies, the Account of My Hut becomes an aesthetic ideal for a lot of people. And when we study, stuff like the tea ceremony, we see pictures of the tea ceremony. You have to enter the tea house through this tiny little hole, and you're in this room that's not really too big. It's very, very Spartan. Maybe there's a plant, maybe there's like a flower, maybe there's like a wall painting, but it's very bare. This is where that comes from. So all of this is the cultural influence of Zen. So in the next video, we're going to keep going with the Kamakura Shogunate, and we're going to talk about political and military history, and then transition into the rise of the Ashikaga, and from there go into the Sengoku Jidai. So until then, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you found this enlightening, and I will see you all next time.